Managing authentication. Managing an Angular application authentication is a complex issue. The problem is that while the server holds the information about the authenticated user, the Angular application is not aware of that information. One solution is to use a service and ask the server about the authentication status. However, this solution is flawed since all the Angular components will have to wait for the response to return, causing inconsistencies and development overhead. This can be solved using an advanced Angular router object. However, a simpler solution would be to make the Express application render the user object directly in the EJS view and then use an Angular service to serve the object. Rendering the user object. To render the authenticated user object, you'll have to make several changes. Let's begin by changing the app controller's index server controller.js file as follows. Changing it. Maybe it's just my eyes. Really, none of it looks highlighted. Maybe the whole thing's changed. I haven't looked at the code in a while. Let's go ahead and do that while we're here. Don't need the full screen if it don't take all those pixels. Get smaller. Restore down. It's weird. Okay, no it's not. I'm expecting a Windows 10 button to affect a Windows 7 environment. Okay, that's about the pixels it's working at. So we come over here to look at this, and what we'll do is open as brackets project. It always takes a while to load. Next, go to your app views index file and make the following changes. This will render the user object as a JSON representation right in your main view application. When the Angular application bootstraps, the authentication state will already be available. If the user is authenticated, the user object will become available. Otherwise, the user object will be null. Right here's the OR. Window user equals user or null. I'm still, I guess these parentheses are EJ6, EJS. Embedded JavaScript. Okay. This will render the user object as a JSON representation right in your main view application. When the Angular application bootstraps, the authentication state will already be available. If the user is authenticated, the user object will become available. Otherwise, the user object will be null. So that's the loading that we were seeing. That's the one thing we're getting right now when we run the 7 code. So The whole point's to get it to get past that. In the title, I should look up on the title because that's in the head. Okay, so we're just going to look at this. It should be open by now. Which one? App controllers. Index server controller. Okay, it's got the comments. Creates a new render controller method. So if nothing else, I ought to keep up with this code just so I can comment it. But I'll have to do a GitHub copy, a fork to do that. Exports render function. Constant user equals not requested user null. ID requested user ID, first name, last name. Use the response object to render the index view with the title and user properties. Title and user. Response render index. Title will be hello world. So if we're getting past well, it should have a title, and one possible title would be hello world, so we can look at that. Let's pull the code back over. Oh, don't want it to be so small. I was thinking I might throw something in the notes from there to kind of remind me of what I was just talking about, but let's see. I guess title, yeah. I'll just put this part. And I still have the notes open, probably, no, different machine. I got the same program open on two different machines. It can get a bit confusing at times. So this is episode 48 now. No, we're in episode 47. Configuring the authentication routes. So really we got down there at one point. Yeah, so really we can skip down to managing authentication. But for next episode I was talking about stuff that might be worth paying attention to. We'll throw title in here. Cause we're always getting the load. Okay. So again, where were we at? I'm gonna keep reviewing all of it. Never hurts to review it 2 or 3 times. This will render the user object as a JSON representation right in your main view application. When the Angular application bootstraps, the authentication state will already be available. If the user is authenticated, the user object will become available. Otherwise, the user object will be null. Okay, we got that. Modifying the user server controller. To support our authentication refactoring, we'll need to make sure our user server controller is able to process the Angular service request. To do that, you'll need to change the code in your file to look like this. it's going to say loading either way. But if I get Hello World in the title, the error message. So that's another reason I thought it's doing the loading, because there's supposed to be a callback. And it might be setting something up there. If my callbacks on the authentication, it would be sending error messages. So user already exists, something went wrong. .400 send error, else response JSON user. We basically just encapsulated the authentication logic inside two methods that can accept and respond with a JSON object. Now let's go ahead and change the app routes user server routes directory as follows. So I don't think we're necessarily getting this far yet as far as the routes coming back on the API. If anything, say sign in scope. So the call, I don't know if the callbacks would have affected that earlier or not, like when it first loads the site. Note how we removed the routes that we used to render our authentication views. More importantly, look at the way in which we added an API prefix for all the routes. Okay, so maybe if it's going through the API first and the callback's not matching, that maybe something over in the API is saying, hey, it's not loading, it's not going to load. Prefix for all the routes. It is a very good practice to keep all your routes under one prefix, since we want the Angular router to be able to have routes that do not interfere with our server routes. Now that we have our server side ready, it's time to create our Angular Authentication Module. Creating the Authentication Module. Now that we're done with laying the ground for our Angular application, we can move forward and refactor our authentication logic into a cohesive authentication module. To do that, we'll begin by creating a new folder inside our public app folder called Authentication. In our new folder, create a file named Authentication Module TypeScript with the following code. For child authentication routes. For child authentication routes. Router module for child. Declarations. Authentication component SignIn Component, SignUp Component. Our module consists of three components: an Authentication Component, a SignUp Component, a SignIn Component. We also included an authentication routing configuration in the Angular's Forms module to support our sign-in and sign-up forms. Let's begin by implementing the base authentication component. Creating the authentication component. We'll begin by creating our authentication component hierarchy. Then we will convert our server sign-in. Creating the authentication component. Alright. We'll begin by creating our authentication component hierarchy. Then we will convert our server sign-in and sign-up views into Angular templates, add the authentication functionality to authentication service, and refactor our server logic. Let's start by creating a file named Authentication Component TypeScript inside our public app authentication folder. In the new view file, paste the following code. In this code, we implement our new authentication component. We begin by importing the authentication service and a sign-up and sign-in component, all of which we haven't created yet. Another thing to notice is that this time we used an external template file for our component. We'll continue by creating a routing configuration for our Authentication Module, configuring the authentication routes. To do that, create a new file named Authentication Routes TypeScript in our public app authentication folder. In the new file, paste the following code. Import routes from Angular Router. Import Authentication Component from Authentication Component. Import SignIn Component from SignIn.component. Import SignUp Component from SignUp Component. Export constant authentication routes. Routes equal, so we got square brackets down to where, it's getting the children. That's why I was talking about the children routes earlier. Okay, down to this square bracket. No, we got double squares. Okay. So it goes all the way down to this square. But this one wraps the children. Okay, so that's the last property there. So export constant routes equal, okay. So the whole thing's one big object. Authentication component. Okay, now I get it. So basically, when somebody logs in, instead of having to keep logging in every time they go to a component, it's going to log them in once, and then kind of serve. This authentication piece is going to kind of serve as the bouncer. So they'll stay in here, but then go out to these as they get it won't get to these until they've passed through here. So they won't stay here, but like one of these might lead them out a back door or exit somewhere in the program, but as they come back in through the bouncer, he'll let them into this object, and then they'll go to the rest of the app, wherever that might be, whatever component of the app they're using, which starts to just sign in or sign up. But once they're signed in, that brings them back around. They'll stay. Well, maybe not. I might be misinterpreting that. Let's keep reading. As you can see, we create a new routes instance with a parent route of authentication and 2 child routes for the sign in and sign up components. We'll continue by creating the template file named Authentication Template HTML. Inside our components folder in the new file, paste the following code. It's all one big div with 3 links, and I think this is a directive. Router outlet, open and close tag for a router outlet. Now how should we use, let's see, router outlet. We haven't written that yet, have we? Or did we? I don't think so. I think it's setting, I think it's showing us how to write that. Because that's what Angular apparently does, is let you write your own tags. That's what we're doing, is creating the component, and those tags apparently are the component. Just gotta make all the stuff that component represents. Alright, note how we used the router outlet directive inside our code. This is where our subcomponents will be rendered. They'll render them here. This is where our subcomponents will be rendered. Oh, so is that what they mean by singular page app? So they won't have to render. This div will hold as a bookmarker. This will actually serve as the bouncer. But because they're already logged in here, he can throw them around where the router, he can throw them around inside of here wherever they need to go. If I'm understanding that right though, then you'd have these 3 links at the top of every page while the rest of your app's rendered inside of here, so that doesn't quite make sense yet. Unless they're using like jQuery to make these fade, like they're still there, you just can't see them. Maybe. This is where our subcomponents will be rendered. We'll continue with creating these subcomponents. Creating the SignIn component. Okay. It's just the subcomponents. Okay, so this is okay, that makes more sense. I think I'm confusing the bouncer and the whatever this would be a different piece. Note how you to implement the SignIn component, create a new folder named SignIn inside your public app authentication folder. Inside your new folder, create a new file named SignIn Component TypeScript with the following code. Okay, it's not too bad. Import component from Angular core. Import router from Angular router. Import authentication service from authentication service. At component selector SignIn. At component selector SignIn template URL. Export class SignIn component. Error message credentials any equals constructor private authentication service private router sign in. This authentication service sign in. Oh, it's pretty close. It's 25. Where are we at? We're not quite the halfway mark. I really want to get through the whole page, but I didn't want to speed read either. I feel like I'm understanding it better. I know I reviewed it, a lot of this in the previous episode, so maybe I should change my notes up. Let's see how far we got compared to last time. It's another tab. Did I close it? This will do. It's not what I was looking for, but it's got the same information. So I'm not really, we'll have to move this content for 48 down, I guess. We'll just do it like this. We'll keep the break. Get a new link, or sorry, list item. Copy that. Okay, new list item would go after the break, because we got another one down here. So 48 will end up being 49. I'll probably pull it over to Tuesday anyways. This one's now 48. And really I don't think we covered any of that. Instead we covered some of this again. Let's take a look. Creating the SignIn component. So we got just a little bit further. Got a lot farther the first time. Kind of just reviewing the same stuff again. I might even just delete 48. Let's see. No. Creating the SignIn component. Creating the sign up component. Okay, so I copied all that npm start. Okay, so I really just need to delete up to where we got creating the SignIn component. We got that far. We didn't get the sign up component yet. That one's bold. Bold again. Creating the SignIn component. So basically we stayed that same spot the whole episode, but we also reviewed this again, which I felt like I got better this time. So I guess that was the important part right there. That's what I need. Managing authentication. Okay, that's a little better. So this will be a very brief break. We'll stand up, get some blood flow back in the legs. We'll come right back and do this episode 48, starting with creating the SignIn component. And we'll leave that. That's a bold. That's for that's the top of the page. Okay, brief break. Stop recording.